Grok 4 is smarter than almost all graduate students. Pick anything, and we're talking about questions that it's never seen before. These are not on the internet. The reasoning capabilities of Grok are incredible.
They asked Grok AI about the resurrection of Jesus Christ in the Ethiopian Bible, expecting a familiar answer. Instead, the system pointed to texts preserved for over 1,600 years that describe events and teachings missing from modern scripture, raising a deeper question about what may have been left out. The AI answer that shocked everyone. Inside a quiet lab in California, during the early hours of 2:47 a.m., Dr. Rachel Torres pushed Grok AI into a domain most systems avoid. The prompt was simple: explain the resurrection of Jesus Christ using the Ethiopian canon. But the response didn't follow the structure established after the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. Instead, the system began referencing texts preserved in Ethiopia for over 1,600 years, pointing to writings absent from Western scripture. These included extended post-resurrection teachings, dialogues and instructions attributed to Jesus that do not appear in the 66-book Bible used across Europe and North America. As the output continued, the shift became impossible to ignore. Grok didn't frame these texts as apocryphal or secondary. It treated them as parallel records, preserved within the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, suggesting that early Christianity may have contained a broader narrative. The response outlined how certain teachings focused less on the resurrection as a single event and more on what followed: extended guidance, secret knowledge, and spiritual instruction delivered after the crucifixion. This is where the tension escalated. The system highlighted that these writings were not newly discovered. They had existed continuously within Ethiopian tradition, untouched by the canon decisions made in 4th century Rome. The implication wasn't stated directly, but it was clear in structure. What most of the world recognizes as the complete account may represent only a portion of a larger historical record. What began as a routine AI test had shifted into something else entirely. A comparison between traditions separated not by belief, but by preservation. And once that comparison was visible, the idea of a single, unified narrative became harder to maintain. The resurrection remained central, but the story surrounding it no longer looked the same. The Bible most people never knew existed. Far from the theological centers of Rome and Constantinople, a different canon continued to exist in Ethiopia, preserved through centuries of isolation and continuity. The Ethiopian Bible contains between 81 books and 88 texts, depending on the version, far exceeding the 66 books recognized in most Western traditions. This difference is not minor. It represents over 20 additional writings, many of which date back to early Jewish and Christian periods. Among these texts are the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the Book of the Covenant, each carrying narratives and teachings absent from mainstream scripture. These writings expand on themes only briefly mentioned elsewhere, detailing angelic hierarchies, cosmic events, and extended spiritual laws. While many of these texts were excluded during canon formation processes in the 4th century, they were never removed in Ethiopia because they were never excluded in the first place. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintained its canon continuously for more than 1,600 years, preserving manuscripts in the ancient language of Ge'ez. Unlike Western traditions shaped by councils, translations, and revisions across Europe, this canon followed a different path, one defined by preservation rather than selection. What makes this significant is not just the number of books, but their content. Some of these texts contain references to events and teachings that align with early Jewish traditions predating Christianity itself. Others expand on figures and stories that appear only briefly in the Standard Bible, offering additional context that changes how those narratives are understood. The existence of this canon does not rewrite history on its own, but it introduces a parallel version of it, one that has existed in plain sight, largely unknown outside of Ethiopia. And once that parallel is acknowledged, the idea of a single, complete biblical narrative becomes more complex than it first appears. A Christianity older than Rome. Christianity entered Ethiopia in the early 4th century during the reign of King Ezana, when much of Europe was still divided in belief. This matters because the Ethiopian church formed its foundations before authority was consolidated in Rome, while the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD began defining unified doctrine. Ethiopia had already developed its own interpretations. This shows that Ethiopian Christianity emerged as a parallel tradition, not a branch shaped by Roman control. At the same time, Ethiopian scholars focused on preservation rather than revision. Monasteries in regions like Lalibela and Aksum protected texts written in Ge'ez, an ancient language maintained across generations. These manuscripts were not altered through councils or political influence. Instead, they were copied by monks over centuries, keeping the wording and structure consistent with earlier forms. This difference in approach shaped how the tradition evolved. While Western Christianity experienced translation changes and canon decisions over time, Ethiopian tradition maintained continuity without reduction. Texts such as the Book of Enoch, removed from most European traditions after the 5th century, continued to be read and preserved in Ethiopian churches. The result is a version of Christianity that developed alongside Rome, but followed its own path, maintaining a broader and more continuous record of early teachings. What Jesus did after the resurrection. According to Ethiopian texts, the period following the resurrection of Jesus Christ did not end immediately after a brief appearance, but extended over 40 days of continued presence and instruction. This timeline is referenced in early Christian tradition, but Ethiopian writings expand on what occurred during that period. This matters because it shifts the focus from a single event to an extended phase of teaching. Instead of closing the narrative, the resurrection becomes the beginning of a deeper exchange. Now this is where it becomes important. These texts describe Jesus not only as a teacher, but as a figure operating with direct authority, delivering structured guidance to his followers. The teachings include warnings about future divisions, instructions on spiritual discipline, and explanations of hidden doctrines that are not detailed in the standard New Testament. That distinction is important. It changes how the role of the resurrection is understood, not as a conclusion, but as a transition into something more complex. This is where the shift becomes clear. The emphasis moves away from external events and toward internal transformation. Instead of focusing on miracles or public displays, the teachings highlight discipline, awareness, and preparation. This alters the tone of the narrative. It becomes less about witnessing an event and more about understanding its implications. A clear example appears in writings preserved in Ethiopian tradition, where post-resurrection conversations include structured instructions given to specific followers over a defined period. These are not random additions. They follow a consistent framework tied to early Christian timelines and locations such as Jerusalem and surrounding regions during the 1st century. The result is a longer, more detailed account of what happened after the resurrection. And once that extended timeline is considered, the original narrative no longer appears complete on its own. The warnings that feel too modern. The Ethiopian texts record a series of warnings attributed to Jesus Christ, delivered during the 40 days following the resurrection and preserved across Ethiopia for over 1,600 years. These warnings focus not on the past, but on what would happen to his message over time. The content explains that the teachings would not remain intact as they spread beyond their original setting in the 1st century. Instead, they would gradually shift as different groups adopted, interpreted, and structured them according to their own needs. The writings describe a pattern where belief begins as guidance, but slowly becomes tied to authority. Leaders emerge who speak in the name of faith, yet operate within systems that prioritize influence and control. That distinction is important. It separates the original message from the structures that later form around it. The warnings do not reject organization itself, but they highlight how easily purpose can be replaced by performance. In several passages, future religious systems are described as outwardly disciplined, yet internally hollow. The language is precise. It refers to visible rituals, formal gatherings, and strict appearances that no longer reflect the original intent of the teachings. This creates a gap between what is shown publicly and what is practiced privately. A clear example appears in descriptions of leaders who present themselves as righteous while exploiting those under their care. These patterns can be traced across historical developments, including institutional expansions seen in 4th century Rome, where belief and governance became closely connected. The same manuscripts also describe how vulnerable groups, such as the poor and the weak, are often affected first when systems shift away from their original purpose. These details were preserved in monastic centers like Aksum, where texts were copied carefully across generations, maintaining consistency without revision. The teachings that challenge the system. The Ethiopian writings also preserve a set of teachings attributed to Jesus Christ that focus on direct connection rather than structured mediation, maintained in Ge'ez manuscripts across Aksum and Gondar for more than 1,600 years. These teachings present faith as an internal process, not dependent on institutions, buildings, or formal authority. The structure is simple. Access to God is described as immediate and personal, without the need for intermediaries. This changes how authority is defined. Leadership is not positioned as a gatekeeping role, but as a responsibility grounded in behavior. Individuals are evaluated by their actions, not by titles or positions they hold within a system. That distinction is important. It removes automatic legitimacy and replaces it with continuous accountability. The teachings also shift attention toward community responsibility. Care for widows, the poor, and the sick is presented as central, not secondary. This moves the focus away from ritual performance and toward measurable actions within daily life. In early Christian settings such as Jerusalem during the 1st century, similar patterns can be observed where groups organized around shared resources and direct support systems. Additional passages explain that faith does not require physical structures to remain valid. Temples and institutions are not rejected, but they are no longer treated as essential. This creates a decentralized framework where belief exists independently of location or hierarchy. Within Ethiopian tradition, these teachings were preserved without structural modification, allowing a version of Christianity to remain intact that operates outside centralized control, while still maintaining continuity with early historical settings. Why these texts were removed? The formation of the biblical canon was not a passive process. It took shape during organized gatherings such as the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, under the influence of Constantine I in Rome. These meetings were focused on unifying belief across expanding regions. As Christianity spread through parts of Europe, differences in teachings, texts, and interpretations created pressure for consistency. The solution was selection, defining which writings would represent the official structure and which would remain outside it. The texts preserved in Ethiopia reflect material that circulated before these decisions were finalized. Many of these writings emphasize direct spiritual awareness, personal understanding, and internal authority. That distinction changes how belief operates. When individuals are positioned as directly connected, the need for centralized interpretation becomes less critical. This creates a different kind of structure, one that is harder to standardize across large populations. Historical patterns show that writings with symbolic language, visionary experiences, or layered meanings introduced variability in interpretation. That variability became difficult to manage as Christianity moved from small communities into organized institutions. In regions shaped by 4th century Rome, clarity and uniform teaching were becoming necessary for governance and cohesion. Texts such as the Book of Enoch, which remained active in Ethiopian tradition but faded from Western use after the 5th century, illustrate how certain writings were gradually set aside. Their removal follows a pattern connected to structure rather than randomness. Content that extended beyond controlled teaching or encouraged independent interpretation became less compatible with a unified system. Over time, the canon reflected not just spiritual content, but also the need for stability, consistency, and alignment across growing institutions. The hidden teachings about life and death. The Ethiopian manuscripts present a detailed view of life and death that differs in tone and structure from later simplified interpretations. These writings, preserved across Ethiopia for more than 1,600 years, describe death as a transition rather than a final state. The teachings attributed to Jesus Christ place the physical body within a temporary role, while the spirit continues beyond it. This approach shifts attention away from endings and toward continuity. Within these texts, the concept of death is expanded. Physical death is described as a change in state, but not the most significant one. Greater emphasis is placed on disconnection from spiritual awareness. That distinction alters the definition of loss. It suggests that awareness, rather than physical survival, determines the condition of a person. The writings also describe an inner presence that exists within each individual. This presence is not external or distant. It is understood as something that must be recognized and developed over time. Early Christian communities in Jerusalem during the 1st century reflected similar ideas, where belief was practiced as an internal discipline rather than a structured system tied to location. Further passages introduce the idea that human thought and behavior are influenced by forces beyond immediate perception. These include references to guiding influences and opposing pressures, often described through terms such as angels or unseen forces. This expands the framework beyond visible reality and places human experience within a broader, layered structure. These teachings remain preserved in Ethiopian tradition without structural revision, maintaining a consistent perspective on existence that extends beyond physical life and into a continuous process of awareness and transformation. The final prophecy that changes everything. The Ethiopian texts attribute a final set of teachings to Jesus Christ, delivered during the closing phase of the 40 days after the resurrection, preserved in manuscripts across Ethiopia for over 1,600 years. These teachings describe a future condition rather than a historical event. The message explains that faith, over time, would shift into visible performance, where outward actions replace inner meaning. The structure becomes external, focused on display, language, and repetition, while the original purpose begins to fade beneath it. The writings describe a world filled with noise, distraction, and competing claims of truth. Belief becomes widespread, but clarity becomes limited. That distinction is important. It suggests that the presence of religion does not guarantee the presence of understanding. The texts also state that truth will not emerge from established centers of authority or powerful institutions. Instead, it will appear in overlooked places, carried by individuals without status or recognition. References to a fire appear throughout these passages, but the meaning is not tied to destruction. The language describes an internal process, an awakening within individuals, rather than an external event affecting the world. This shifts the interpretation away from physical outcomes and toward personal transformation. These descriptions align with patterns seen across different historical periods, including transitions observed in 4th century Rome, where belief systems became structured, and in later eras where public expression often replaced internal discipline. The preservation of these teachings in locations such as Aksum maintains a consistent narrative that extends beyond institutional frameworks. What this discovery means now. The analysis produced by Grok AI, developed under Elon Musk and tested in environments like California in 2024, did not introduce new material. It connected existing texts that had been preserved for centuries in regions such as Ethiopia. This matters because the information was never lost. It remained outside mainstream awareness, stored within a different canon that continued independently of Western structures. The system identified relationships between these preserved writings and early Christian narratives, suggesting that the teachings of Jesus Christ may extend beyond the commonly accepted framework. That distinction changes how the historical record is viewed. It introduces the possibility that what is widely known represents a selected version rather than a complete one. This comparison brings attention to how religious history developed over time. Institutional structures, shaped during periods like the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, prioritized consistency and unity. At the same time, other traditions maintained a broader collection of texts without modification. The difference between these approaches creates two parallel understandings of the same origin. The result is not a contradiction, but a contrast between centralized systems and personal spiritual interpretation. The preserved Ethiopian texts continue to exist as they were, while modern tools now make them more visible. That visibility changes access, not the content itself, and places both interpretations side by side within the same historical timeline. They asked Grok AI about Jesus' resurrection, but the answer didn't end with belief. It pointed to hidden texts, raising a quiet question about what history chose to keep and what it left behind.